My name's Emma, and I'm usually sitting in that corner over there for all of my days, 7 times a week. But I'm not grounded anymore. I'm not sitting in the corner this morning. That joke landed better. That was funnier than you thought it was. Okay, anyways. I literally, when I get in my car and I'm like somewhere else, I'll get in my car and my Apple Maps will be like 10 minutes to Butterfield Chapel. So I feel like I basically live here. So I'm up here this morning, and you guys are all sitting here this morning, which means you are either being kind to me or you desperately need one more chapel credit. Where's Magnifique at? She was somewhere in here earlier. Okay, maybe she left. Maybe she got the credit and left. But thank you for being here this morning. I know that it's been a crazy semester for most of us, and there's been just so much going on, and I want to be really honest with you this morning. Obviously, we have been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and I've gotten to hear from so many of my friends. 2 of them that spoke are sitting in the front row. Ariana Thomas kicked us off at the beginning of the semester. Matthew spoke last week, and I get to hopefully tie a nice bow on the Sermon on the Mount, but I am not much of a gift wrapper, so we'll see how it goes. But I was thinking this morning and kind of just reflecting on what this past semester has been, and even just like the past week, and all of the challenges and the struggles that it's come with for me, and I'm sure for many of us. But I was on the phone with one of my mentors from high school a lot this week, and I was reminded of when I was in high school and she was mentoring me. And I was 17 years old, and I have this distinct memory of a conversation I had with her. I was sitting in a Barnes & Noble cafe in Bend, Oregon, and we were talking about how I was really bad at the time at being vulnerable on a stage and being honest and real on a stage. But she said something to me, as all good mentors and leaders do, is they call out things in you that you maybe didn't notice before. And she said, I know that you have a hard time being vulnerable on a stage, but when you write, you can't help but be vulnerable and honest. And so my prayer, as I've not 17 anymore and gone through a few more years of life, is that my writing voice and the things that I write in my sermon would also come out in this space and echo through that space. And so in wanting to be honest with you this morning, I just want to tell you that I've never had to trust Jesus more with this sermon than I've ever had. Like, I've never had to trust a sermon or Jesus' ability to work through my words in this sermon. And as just like an accountability note, I never want to stop doing that in the future, right? But I'm inviting you into that space with me to trust that Jesus knows what's going on and wants to speak through me as well. And so before I recount the story that Jesus is telling this morning, I want to start with a story from when I was a kid. So I am from Oregon. My family lives in Oregon. They all farm there. There's the first farm reference of the day. But I actually was raised for the first 15 years of my life in northern Arizona in a town called Flagstaff. And in the summer of 2010, a wildfire was ignited by an abandoned campfire on Father's Day weekend. And because of the dry climate, there's like literally no rain except for 1 month out of the year in Arizona. It caught quickly, very quickly, and basically took up the entire mountain range that was situated behind my house. And it burned at 0% containment for almost 2 weeks. It covered 15,000 acres, and it left the mountain in my backyard devastated beyond recognition. I was actually back there this summer, and you can still see, however many years later, the fire, just how much damage it did. And so it burned up to the boundary line of my family's fence, of so many other people's properties. And there's actually no structures lost in their homes, but the real devastation is what happened in the month after. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what's called monsoon season, but monsoon season happens in Arizona and then also parts of Africa. It's kind of funny. But monsoon season, if you're not familiar, is this time, it's 1 month out of the year, usually in between July and August, when huge thunderstorms come and rain for like a month. And it's like giant thunderstorms, all of like so much lightning and rain and water. And they happen, it's like super interesting. It's really hot in the morning, and you can like look up at the mountains, and there's these big, dark, angry clouds gathering on the mountains. And then mid-afternoon strikes, and then all of them break over the mountain, and the water comes rushing down. And it's actually really, usually very welcome season in Arizona because there's not a ton of rain. It's not anything new to the locals. But this summer, right after the fire, it was different because of the devastation of the wildfire that had taken place above our town. And so the landscape of the mountain was bare. All of the trees and the plant and all of the plant matter was eradicated from the topsoil. And to make matters worse, the soil itself was burned, and all the nutrients and substance that would have soaked up water was gone. I remember walking around and riding our horses, reference number 2, around in my backyard, and the dirt was literally bright red because it had just been scorched and charred beyond any purpose or value. And scientists and environmentalists were observing, looking at the signs, and were making predictions early on to us that because of all of these collective factors, a monsoon season would create an unprecedented problem of flash flooding. In other words, the water had nowhere else to go when the clouds broke over the mountain. And so instead of soaking into the soil and the plant matter, it would actually just be rushing to the people and the houses and everything that was below. And they were right. I have this really distinct memory of waking up in the middle of the night in my childhood bedroom the night after the first storm, and my family and I all went out and stood on our front porch, and you could hear just this really eerie sound of water just rushing down the mountain and towards all of us and all of the houses and farms and barns and everything that was below. And my childhood home was situated at the very base of the mountain range, and luckily nothing on our property was destroyed, but within walking distance, within just a few miles. Others weren't so lucky. And there was so many people, and so for so many weeks our neighbors were evacuated and relocated and held their breath as the water came rushing down to their homes and to their belongings, took out entire portions of roads, swept away barns and livestock, and it altered the landscape forever. That year, our town made the national news 4 times, once for snowfall. It does snow in Arizona, particularly in northern Arizona, against popular belief. Tornadoes, I don't know where that came. That's not normal. That doesn't happen. That's not popular belief. And then the massive wildfire that happened. And then finally, the emergency flash flooding. And all of the local pastors who based their eschatology on Left Behind and Kirk Cameron were convinced we were living in the last days, and all the newscasting stations. It was very, very surreal. But we can talk about proper eschatology later if you want. I love that conversation. But the fall eventually came, and the rain subsided, and those who had been affected were finally able to return home to survey the damage and begin to evaluate what could be salvaged after what had happened. And in the text we're reading today, and in a very similar manner, I think that Jesus is explaining to a large group of people about the inevitability of the storms of life, and posing a question to them and asking them what they will do to ensure these storms. So to set the scene of where this is being lived out, where Jesus is talking with these people on the mountainside, countless people have gathered to hear him speak. And at this point in the Sermon on the Mount, they've been there for quite some time. For us, we've been here for a whole semester, but they had been there for a few hours. And they're listening intently, whether out of reverence or maybe just curiosity, and drinking in his words with expectation of what he was going to say, or maybe just because of the sheer audacity that they held. And his words are definitely audacious to some, but to us, we should receive them as being meaningful and intentional, because in this sermon, he's not only giving a really important piece of the gospel and how we're supposed to live our lives out, but he's also establishing the explicit nature of his identity as Lord. He's not speaking in terms of my Father in heaven. He's saying these words of mine, which is indicative of his Christology. He's establishing his authority as Lord. So the verse that we're going to be in today is Matthew 7:24 through 27. It's the parable of the wise and the foolish builders, and it says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand." So sorry, I just completely lost my space. "The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Would you pray with me? God, I ask for your peace, both in my words and just my whole body as I speak and as I want to convey what you have to say to us, but also for the people sitting in this room who are, finals week is upon us, and we need peace, we need strength, we need endurance. And so would you guide my words? Would they be only from you? And I just want to participate in what you have to say to us this morning. Amen. So I was reading this verse a couple of months ago when I was beginning to prepare for this message, and I don't know a ton about houses or building houses or houses in general, besides the fact that I will not probably own one anytime soon or in the distant future. Van life doesn't look super attractive to me, but financially it looks attractive to me. But I also am not a minimalist, and I own a disco ball, so that probably wouldn't work for me. Anyways, I don't know about houses, and I live in campus housing, but I do go to Northwest, which means I do know a little bit about the context of the Bible, because I've hopefully been listening in my classes, and Jesus is speaking in a parabolic sense here. There's obviously a deeper meaning that goes beyond the metaphors that he's using of sand, of rock, and of storms. And this text is also a double parallel. There's two stories with two builders and two different outcomes, and Jesus is comparing them side by side and asking not only the people he's speaking to, but to us, asking us to observe what's happening and how we fit into these two different parables and these two different stories. And it's important to note that these storms that he's talking about were inevitable to those who were listening to him that day in the Sermon on the Mount. The members of his audience would have been very familiar with the storms that often passed through Palestine. They themselves sat on the side of a mountain that day, and they would have been well acquainted with the hilly terrain of the region and the destruction that water could cause. Water has such a power and ability to alter the landscape drastically. And furthermore, the people in the audience not only would have understood the physical meaning of this, but if they were listening to the deeper meaning beyond the metaphors, they would have heard the point that Jesus was trying to make. That the storms of life, of hardship, of loss and poverty and illness and corruption would surely appear on the horizon sooner or later. So rather than explaining to them that the storms were imminent, he's asking them if they will heed his words and asking what it is they will build their lives upon. And the same storms of life are inevitable to those of us who hear his words today. And sure, there's the physical storms of the natural created order that we all experience, like the summer storms from my childhood, or Seattle's version of the world ending, which is like 2 inches of snow in February when we all freak out, and all there's like a Prius graveyard on the highway. That one's for Cole because he's from Colorado, and we've bemoaned this together. But I would assume, and I know, I don't have to assume, I know that you and I are also familiar with the other storms that Jesus is referring to, the storms that exist just beyond the tangible and the physical, the ones that cause us to wear raincoats, and if you're not from a rainy area, use an umbrella. Jesus is offering a warning and a choice to those in the crowd who are listening to him. And he's talking about two different types of builders, those who are wise and those who are foolish. Those who are wise are like the individuals who build their houses upon the firm foundation of bedrock, and those who are foolish are like those who choose sand as their foundation that sifts and sways beneath the structures that they've raised. So what will we be likened to? Jesus is offering a warning and a choice of those of us today who are listening. And I think that we could be mistaken, just as I was mistaken when I was first preparing this message, when penning the words of this sermon, to read this text and immediately separate the wise and the foolish builders to the religious and the secular, the believers and the non-believers. That's easy for us to do. It's easy for us to rush to us being in the inside of the crowd and not on the outside. And undoubtedly, Jesus' words are equally important for those who have not received the gospel and don't know the good news. But I would be remiss, if I just didn't take the time to take inventory of my own life and not just assume that my life is being built upon what is sturdy and steadfast. I have to perceive whether or not every single day I have been standing upon a firm foundation that will be sustained or one that will fail. And so even in the realm of Christianity, in the seemingly safe bubble of a private Christian university, there are so many things that might look like supple material for building our lives upon. Things that are vying for attention, convincing us of a perceived sense of security. Materials that claim that they too hold ultimate gospel truth in a world that is tormented by so many storms. There's materials that are made up of financial security or political ideologies or college degrees and credit scores or finding the right person to spend your life with or finding a therapist when it wasn't the right person to spend your life with or 2 months with, whatever it is. Could be accolades or echo chambers on social media that convince us that we've got it all right. And all of these I'm guilty of building my life upon. And to these, I'm no exception. There are days when I'm building my life upon sand, and there are days when I'm building it upon something solid. And all of those things that I mentioned are not inherently bad, so please hear me when I say that. But all of it inevitably will be altered, transformed, and affected at some point or another in this life. And this text that we're in today is situated at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. And like any good public speaker, Jesus gives his audience a call to action. And he's posing an embedded question, if we are listeners of his word, that we can hear, to those who are listening to him. Upon what or who will you build your life? And it's important to note that the Sermon on the Mount is not merely ethical either. We have to be really careful not to dismiss the Christology and the wonder and the authority of Jesus and just sum his life up to a mere ethical code. We can all agree that healthy relationships and regular exercise and calling your loved ones are good and worthwhile things, but there's a bigger ask here, a deeper invitation that goes beyond living an ethical life, and we cannot miss it. I cannot miss it. Because all of those things that we are building our lives upon that are not Jesus will be emptied of their assumed power at the end of the age. And Jesus is asking us, will your life, your actions, and your obedience look recognizable to me even after you've weathered the storms of life? So if we know, for certain, as most of us are, that the landscape of our hearts and our lives and our faith will inevitably be altered by the storms of this life, we have to answer his posed question, upon what will we build our lives? Philippians 1:27 reminds us that whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come in and see or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but that you will be saved, and that by God. During that summer of all those natural disasters in my life, I remember distinctly my mom. My mom is like the hardest working woman I've ever met. Like if people tell me I'm hardworking, like my mom goes above and beyond in all that she does and just working so hard to basically sustain everything that she is in her life. But I have these really distinct memories, and they're endearing now. At the time, everything that was happening with the flooding was crazy, but she just immediately woke up every single morning and just had this desire to serve the people who are being affected around us. And my mom is maybe 110 pounds, maybe, and she drives an F-350, a giant truck. And she'll pull up places and be like, "Oh, is that your dad?" And I'm like, "Nope, that's my mom, Kelly. That's her." But I have these really vivid memories that summer of her gathering up me and my two younger sisters in shovels and buckets and rags, and we would just drive to random strangers' houses who had been affected by the floodwaters. And to whoever was in our proximity that we could help. And in reality, I look back on it now, and preparations had been made to prevent this flooding. There was this abandoned gas station that was just on the road from where we lived, that the city had just like dumped these giant piles of sand, and there's people there all day long helping random strangers and people they had never met before fill up sandbags to go around their houses. There was giant concrete, they're called Jersey barriers, which is a cow breed, by the way, too, fun fact. Giant concrete barriers that were set up to divert the water elsewhere. Flood and fire insurance was being bought. My mom was like in line buying flood insurance as the rain was coming down for the first time. Very surreal moment. But in those moments, we're helping our neighbors, we're helping these people we've never met before. It occurs to me now that at that point, after the storms, no one was asking how the fire could have been prevented in the first place. No one was asking how the rain could have been stopped, how the flood waters might have been diverted better. No one was calculating just how many more sandbags it would have taken to avoid the reality of the situation. Those things were trivial in hindsight, inevitable, and the timeline of what had happened could not be altered. And so as we helped our neighbors shovel so much mud, like up to here, mud off of their carpet, of their living room floors, the real questions that were being posed were, what might be salvaged? What had sustained the storm? What was still valuable and what was still recognizable after all of the devastation that had taken place? I was 12 that summer. I was not very old. I had bangs and glasses still, but the bangs are gone, thank God. And I didn't know a ton, but I have this memory of standing in one of those people's living rooms, of a stranger that eventually became a friend of our family, and shoveling mud off of the carpet. And it was one of those moments, it's like kind of a core memory of when I realized just how complex and difficult and nuanced life is. I remember sitting in the living room, and there's evidence of life that had taken place in that living room. There was photos of, framed photos of their family on the walls. There's couches and tables and places where community and life and laughter and love had clearly taken place. But in light of what had happened, it was so hard to see that. It was so hard to view the life in spite of the vantage point of death and destruction and just so much devastation. And that was maybe the first time I remember feeling that about life, but it certainly was not the last. And I'm sure that all of us can point to a moment where we've stood in the wreckage of our lives and had to ask what can be salvaged from here. In these past couple of weeks, I have been lamenting how the death of someone or something as we know it threatens to view how we understand its life. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I mean, a couple weeks ago during Thanksgiving, I had a family friend who tragically lost her mom within a few days' time from a random rare disease that they weren't even aware of. And I was talking to her, and she said, it's hard to remember my mom and the life that she lived without thinking about the beeping of hospital machines right now. Maybe some of us have been hurt by a church or a leader, and it's hard to disseminate the good we experience from them from the harm that they've caused us. In transparency, I even think about my own childhood home that I've been talking about that was spared by the floodwaters, that my parents built from the ground up, hoping to live out their lives there, that was sold a few years later because they decided to get divorced. And I don't have all the answers, and I'm sure that I could talk to any one of you in this room and talk about the complexity of the situations and stories in your life. And I'm all too familiar with the beauty and the brokenness that exists and coexists in the world. Life is so complex. That's why we still cry at the celebration of someone's life. That's why we still care and have compassion for those who have deeply hurt us. And Jesus is not asking us to build lives so secure or sturdy or storm-proof that they remain unaltered by just living and breathing and existing in the world. And if we were living in such a manner that prevented us from doing so, what a shame that would be. But he is asking us what we will build our lives upon, even as the ground and the landscape around us is altered and often distorted. And I've just been pondering this reality, particularly this week, of how hard it is to understand and view our lives from the viewpoint of so much pain and destruction and death. But I realize that there's a paradox here, as there always is in the gospel, and it's that Jesus' death determined my life. Jesus' death determines our lives, the redemption and the renewal of them. And he's imploring that we build our lives upon him, that we would trust in him in a manner that will ensure that our actions and our faith is recognizable to him at the end of the day. And will there be evidence of our lives yielded to Jesus in the end? And so I've been asking you for the past 20 minutes what you will build your life upon. And I've been asking myself that same question. And I don't have the answers, but I have a few half-formed thoughts usually. But I came across this poem by a writer a couple of weeks ago that brought me a lot of clarity and peace, and it began to maybe formulate what I want to build my life upon, which is the person of Jesus. And so I want to read it for you before we go about our day. This is by Ming Wei, and it says this. "Are you a Christian?" she asks. I want to say, what do you mean by Christian? Tell me what it means to you, and I'll tell you if I'm one or not. Because if Christian means one still captivated by that dusty Jewish rabbi who loved the untouchable by touching, then yes, I am. If Christian means dancing, raging, laughing, crying with divinity, then yes, I am. If Christian means believing that love will have the final word, then yes, I am. Do you go to church? She asks. I want to say, tell me what you mean by church, and I'll tell you if I go. If by church you mean breaking bread, drinking wine with those who love that dusty rabbi, then yes, I go. If church means listening to a sermon the mountain stream sings and tilting my head up in a cathedral of trees, then yes, I go. If church means learning and growing with and alongside other dusty humans, then yes, I go. Words, they mean things to you, to me, to all of us. Tell me what they mean to you, then I'll tell you if I am. I'll tell you if I go. And I read this, and again, it's just the beginning of what it means to build our lives upon Christ, and that's maybe how I understand Jesus and understand my walk with him. But I encourage you to ask yourself that question today. Upon what will you build your life, and who are you building your life upon? So when the sound of rushing water wakes us up in the middle of the night, as it surely will, as we experience loss and devastation in the altering landscape around us, as the ground shakes beneath us, would we not only hear the words of the Lord, but would we actively receive them and be likened to the wise builder as we construct our lives upon them and bind ourselves to them each and every day. And may we sing even on shaking ground, because our foundation has always been the cornerstone, because it is the dusty rabbi, as Mingwei is talking about, who is trustworthy and secure, and upon whom I want to build my life, whose death determined the significance and redemption of my life. Jesus is all that remains. That is certainly enough for me, and that is good news. Thank you.